Okay, well, thank you for self-organizing there and getting back in your seats. Thank you for that. So we have covered a lot of ground, and now we have one more panel to cover, and it is promising to be a good one. I want to turn it back to the security dimension of the U.S. Japan relationship. And for this, we have assembled another stellar group of experts to talk about this, and I will briefly introduce them in the order that they will present. So first up is Dr. Mori Satoru, who's a professor of contemporary international politics at the Faculty of Law and the deputy director of the Keio Center for Strategy at Keio University. Next, we will hear from Dr. Zach Cooper, who is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, an adjunct professor at Princeton University, partner with Armitage International, and chairman of the board of the Open Technology Fund. And our final speaker is Dr. Teruoka Ayumi, who is a postdoctoral research scholar with the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University and a postdoctoral research fellow with the Columbia Harvard China and the World program.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank the RAND Corporation, the Japan House of Los Angeles, and the Japanese Consulate in Los Angeles for organizing and hosting and supporting this event. It's a real privilege to be able to speak here today. I've been tasked to speak about Japan's security policy, and Jeffrey actually gave us some guiding questions, and so 4 of these. Number 1, what are Prime Minister Ishiba's major priorities in security-related issues? Number 2, among these, what areas do I expect to see change and continuity? And number 3, where does Prime Minister Ishiba expect to face the greatest challenge in his efforts, and what are the implications for the alliance? And number 4, what kind of security relationship does Japan want to see with China, and how likely do you think it is for that to materialize? So those are the 4 big questions that I got, but what I would like to do is sort of address these questions in 3 big chunks of Prime Minister Ishiba's priorities. And number 1 is deterrence of China. I think here I sort of expect complex issues. I will address 2 issues. One is conventional nuclear entanglement. The other one is called gray zone challenges in the South China Sea, East China Sea, and also coercion around Taiwan. This is going to be continuity, and there are already efforts underway to address these questions, but they are likely to continue. And the second priority would be deterring North Korea. And I think here I'll talk about not only US ROK, but also US ROK Japan trilateral relationship and some of the challenges that might come out from a new policy by the Trump administration. And thirdly, of course, is probably the most important, maintenance and strengthening of the Japan-US alliance. So I'll try to address changes and continuities and also challenges in those 3 areas. So starting with deterrence of China, I think starting around 2021, the Japanese expert community started looking at China's growing nuclear arsenal. And many experts started talking about the so-called stability-instability paradox, and this sort of highlighted the challenge that we face in the conventional military balance in the Indo-Pacific. The notion was that a sort of a stability near-peer situation in the nuclear domain is actually going to sort of compel China, which has revisionist ambitions in the region, to sort of become more confident in achieving its military goals by using its conventional forces. And this has created a lot of concern among the Japanese, not only the policymakers, but also the security policy experts. And in order to sort of look at this conventional challenge, I think we should look at this structure, where this structure is defined by an asymmetry between strategic depth and also conventional strike capabilities. What I mean by that is China has this large inventory of ballistic cruise missiles and also hypersonic weapons to go after a very limited number of Japanese and American bases in the Western Pacific. But on the other hand, U.S. and Japan, we mainly rely on U.S. air-launched and sea-launched cruise missiles, and they have to go after a large set of Chinese targets. And so there is this very profound asymmetry between China on the one hand and U.S. Japan on the other hand. And so we recognize this conventional imbalance and that we are trying to address this imbalance through several major efforts. One is through Japan's fundamental bolstering of the defense capabilities, and Japan has been concentrating on investing in 7 core capabilities that they have identified in the 2022 National Defense Strategy. Number 1 is standoff capabilities or long-range precision strike capabilities. Number 2 is integrated air and missile defense. And 3rd is uncrewed systems. 4th is cross-domain operation capabilities. This is about space cyber and electromagnetic domain capabilities. And 5 is command and control intelligence capabilities. 6th is strategic mobility, and 7th is sustainment and acquisition. And so Japan is investing in these 7 areas. For the next fiscal year, I think the Ministry of Defense has come up with a defense budget plan that has reached 8.7 trillion yen. I think it's the first time that we've actually gone beyond 8 trillion yen. And 1/9 of this budget is actually going to be invested in counter-strike capabilities, which is pretty outstanding, I think. And they are going to also start investing in satellite constellations that will be used to track some of the hypersonic weapons and all other missile capabilities by China and North Korea. So those are some efforts that are being undertaken by Japan, and this was already starting back in 2022, so it's going to continue, I think, with much sort of a higher intensity. And another line of effort is to sort of address these issues by looking at the reliance on U.S. theater nuclear forces, because if we are unable to sort of fundamentally redress this conventional imbalance in the Western Pacific, that means that U.S. and Japan will have to increasingly rely on U.S. theater nuclear forces. And this has sort of highlighted the significance of U.S. extended deterrence. Nowadays, I think in Washington and Tokyo, we have many workshops addressing U.S. extended deterrence issues. It's sort of like extended deterrence festival because we have so many workshops and conferences here. But it has sort of highlighted the significance of U.S. Extended deterrence. And right now, in the U.S.-Japan bilateral context, we have elevated the level of dialogue to the ministerial level. I think this is likely to continue. And one other notable development towards the end of last year was the adoption of the U.S.-Japan Extended Deterrence Guidelines. The contents of these guidelines has not been disclosed, but it signals that at the working level they are trying to figure out how to deal with the growing threat of China's increasing nuclear arsenal in the region. So those are some issues, extended deterrence, and also Japan's conventional capabilities will contribute to sort of escalation management consultations between U.S. and Japan, not only in the context of counter-strike capabilities, but in also other areas as well. So yes, extended deterrence, Japan's conventional capabilities, and also escalation management. Those are some of the three areas that are relevant in the conventional context. Also, I think one other challenge that we are facing right now is China's coercion towards Taiwan. I think addressing this issue is very difficult. China's coercion towards Taiwan is multifaceted. It's not only military, but it's also economic, and it also involves information warfare. But I don't think we have actually come up with sort of a systematic counter-coercion strategy. I think doing a sort of a tit-for-tat symmetric response to Chinese military coercion is not the right way to go. It's probably going to be very difficult to sort of convince China to stop what it's doing right now. So I think the way to go is to sort of respond asymmetrically in other non-military areas, to sort of send a signal to China that this kind of coercive behavior is not welcomed in the region. So those are some issues that are related to China, and I think many efforts are already underway, and I expect continuity in this area. Next issue is North Korea, deterrence of North Korea. As we all know, Russia and North Korea cooperation is increasing as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we are very much concerned about what kind of military technology Russia is transferring to North Korea. And I think the current understanding is that North Korea is going to be sort of advancing its 5-year national defense plan to go after a set of defense capabilities that will have ramifications for Northeast Asia military balance. In order to sort of tackle this issue, right now I think there are two possible sort of line of effort to address this issue. Number one is, of course, U.S. ROK bilateral defense cooperation. This is already happening, and it has seen developments in the Washington Declaration and so forth. But also the trilateral, U.S. ROK Japan trilateral security cooperation is very important. We've been trying to sort of institutionalize this framework by establishing secretariat. And also there are ballistic missile defense data sharing arrangements that have happened, and also multi-domain exercises are already also happening as well. So those are three sort of specific programs that the trilateral framework is already undertaking. Our hope is that this will continue with the next South Korean administration. But we'll have to see how Japan-ROK relation will develop. Because I think in the trilateral context, what is critical is how Japan-ROK relations sort of stabilize. And we hope that it will not experience difficulties due to historical issues like the past administration. And our hope is to maintain security cooperation at a significantly stable level. Another issue related to North Korea is what we are very watching with vigilance, what kind of approach the next the Trump administration will pursue vis-a-vis North Korea. I believe that President Trump has referred to the notion of denuclearization, but I think a lot of experts in Tokyo has this understanding that the Trump administration will probably look at North Korea as a threat reduction issue, meaning that it's probably going to be arms control, maybe nuclear arms control negotiations, meaning that they might accept North Korea to sort of maintain a certain level of nuclear arsenal, but put a cap on what it can possess, what a certain amount of nuclear weapons arsenal, and put a cap on it. But we'll have to see. We haven't really seen the specifics of this. And what kind of diplomatic resolutions that the Trump administration might be interested in pursuing. But nevertheless, I think Japan and South Korea will coordinate closely with the Trump administration to sort of find the optimal outcome. We have to also kind of come up with our own ideal outcome, sort of a goal for where we want to be heading with regard to the North Korean nuclear issue. So those were the second set of issues that we think the Ishiba government thinks is very important. And thirdly, but most importantly, maintaining and strengthening the Japan-US alliance. I think I want to sort of start out by pointing out the very basic notion that Japan doesn't have the luxury of creating any rift with the United States. Our security environment is very, very severe. So we can't really afford the luxury of sort of arguing and creating friction with the Trump administration, because appearing to sort of create fissure in the alliance will only create a sort of work to the advantage of China, North Korea, and Russia. And therefore, I think Japan's preferred strategy to managing to deal with the Trump administration is what I would call strategic adaptation. In a way to sort of work out and find out, their notion of what a good ally is. And I think they have a new sort of a definition of what a good ally constitutes. I think there are probably at least two factors. One definition would be an ally that spends significantly on its national defense to allow the United States to defend that country at an acceptable cost. I think this is a sort of a very basic notion. Maybe this kind of notion will carry on to the next Democratic administration, but this is the kind of thinking that the United States probably wants to see in most U.S. allies. And number two is an ally that contributes to U.S. economic growth. Very straightforward. I think the economic value of an ally matters a lot to the Trump administration. So I think Prime Minister Ishiba was successfully sort of address these two issues in the first summit meeting, because we did say that we're going to boost our defense spending up to 2% of GDP on GDP 22 standards by 2027, and also continue to strengthen our defense capabilities beyond 2027. And also on the economic realm, I think it was mentioned in this morning panel, but we're going to make a $1 trillion worth of investment in the United States, and also import LNGs, and sort of approve our sort of economic worth to the United States. And I think this kind of effort will likely continue, but as a result of these kind of efforts, diplomatic approach, we were able to secure three very, very important goals in the summit meeting. Number one was to secure U.S. commitment to defend Japan, including the Senkaku Islands. Number two, to confirm the importance of the peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. And number three was to secure U.S. regional engagement in the Indo-Pacific region. And those three were the fundamental goals going into the summit meeting, and I think we were able to secure those commitments, and I think we have to continue securing those commitments looking at the next 4 years. Specifically, at the more defense cooperation level, we were able to sort of obtain the mandate to advance existing defense cooperation efforts with regard to command and control, with regard to Southwestern Islands access, I think, force posture, with regard to defense industrial cooperation, including forums like DICAS, which is like the acquisition co-production framework, and also multilateral cooperation with other countries in the region. And so these are already underway, and I think it's likely to sort of expand and intensify in the coming years. So we are also likely to see a lot of continuity in the defense cooperation area. And lastly, I want to conclude by what is the biggest challenge for Ishiba, and I think it has to do with the United States. As I mentioned earlier, I think the Trump administration is now sort of redefining its U.S. critical interests that the United States considers worth protecting, even by risking the use of force. And I think the geostrategy of the United States is shifting, and I think the higher prioritization is the region regarding North America and Western Hemisphere probably receives the highest priority, and then comes Indo-Pacific, and then comes Middle East and Europe probably. I think that's the kind of prioritization that the Trump administration now has. And I think from Japan's perspective, what is most important is for the Trump administration and also the United States to sort of have this understanding that peace and prosperity in the Western Pacific is directly tied to U.S. prosperity, peace and prosperity. If they think that this is divisible, meaning that what happens in the Western Pacific or Indo-Pacific does not directly have an adverse effect on U.S. peace and prosperity, then that is going to significantly undermine the credibility of U.S. deterrence in the region. And in order to sort of bolster this kind of notion, not only in Washington, but also in U.S. nationwide, I think what Japan needs to do, alongside in the other Indo-Pacific states, is to engage the United States at all levels, meaning that not only heads of state, but also ministerial level, interagency level, business level, grassroots level, all levels. And I think this kind of engagement by regional states to the United States to sort of nurture this notion that what goes on in East Asia matters fundamentally to U.S. peace and prosperity. And unless this kind of notion is existent, no matter what we do in defense policy or defense cooperation, it's going to be very tough to be able to sort of credibly demonstrate that U.S. is seriously caring about peace and stability in the region. And I think this has direct implications for U.S. Japan alliance. And that's the kind of sort of whole-of-nation approach that Japan will have to take in the coming years to sustain the foundation of the U.S. Japan alliance. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
In thinking. Zach.
Great. Well, thank you, Jeffrey. Wonderful to be here, and thank you to the RAND Corporation, and of course to the Consul General here in Los Angeles, and also to Japan House here. It's just a wonderful place. And I'm really happy to be joined alongside Satoru and Naomi, two old friends. And it's particularly nice that you organize this in the reverse of the way we usually have these discussions, which is about security first and then economics. But I think the reality is economics increasingly is going to come first in the U.S. Japan alliance. And it's a little bit of an adjustment for us security people that we probably have to get used to the next 4 years. But it's going to be a big change, as Satoru was mentioning. So I want to offer some thoughts about what I think that means for us going forward. Jeffrey attempted to give some points, and Gaiatsu does not work on Americans, so I'm going to just say whatever I want, Jeffrey, in whichever order I want. But the bottom line is, I think in many ways the U.S.-Japan alliance is in remarkably good shape, and this came up earlier, but the U.S.-Japan alliance has been in very good shape for basically the whole time I've been working on it through different administrations with very different outlooks. And therefore, we shouldn't be surprised that when President Trump and Prime Minister Ishiba met a few weeks ago, that the meeting went very well. And I think everybody came out quite happy. I know I was watching the live stream and saw when the Japanese delegation came out from the Oval Office. I don't think I've ever seen bigger smiles on Japanese bureaucrats' faces. So they were clearly quite pleased with the meeting. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't going to be changes in the way the alliance functions. And I think the way I would think about some of those changes is that for a long time, especially over the last decade, the U.S. and Japan have had an interlocking strategy, but at times Japan has actually been the developer of that strategy, and the U.S. has been the adopter, which is a little bit of a shift in U.S.-Japan history. I'm thinking about the free and open Indo-Pacific, which the Trump administration adopted wholeheartedly. That was an idea from Prime Minister Abe. And so, really what this was all about was the United States embracing Japan's logic about a rules-based order in East Asia, an order which had both economic components and security components. But that was something that the Trump administration in the first term, I think, was very willing to embrace. I think what we can see already in the second term is that the notion of rules is of much less interest this time around. And Marco Rubio was quite direct about this when he spoke about this in his confirmation hearing. And he said, the rules are essentially constraining the United States, and in fact, the rules-based order is unfair to the United States now. And this is a challenge for Tokyo and for Washington, right? The last decade, we've made a lot of progress by making rules together, and now the U.S. is a little less enamored with rulemaking, and so what role is there for Japan if it's not helping the U.S. make those rules? And so I'm struggling with this a little bit. I think Satoru laid out a very compelling argument about what the U.S. and Japan can do together, but I guess I would just put three proposals on the table, and then I'll hand it back to you, Jeffrey. So the first is, I think we've seen a shocking amount of continuity from the United States across multiple administrations on foreign policy, and Japan has been at the center of all of this. So the places that the United States has done the best in both the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, and my guess where we'll do the best in the second Trump administration, is basically with the countries in East Asia that are most nervous about China's rise. So India, right? After the Sino-Indian border disputes, we've seen India take a much firmer stance. We've seen real advancement in the Quad. Obviously, that started again in the first Trump administration, involved Japan, and the U.S.-India relationship has been quite strong. We've seen Australia, again, another close partner of Japan, work even more closely with the United States in response in part to Chinese economic coercion. We've seen the Philippines, which of course moved very quickly when the Marcos government took over, but once again is a country with which Japan is playing a leading role. And again, concerned by Chinese activities in the security space. And then the two others that I would mention that I think are at the top of the list have been South Korea. Now, obviously, Japan, South Korea, U.S. cooperation is maybe going to be a little bit challenging here, depending on the politics in Seoul. But, you know, another area where the U.S. has made some real progress over multiple administrations, and Japan has been side by side with us and leading those efforts. And then the final one is Taiwan. And, you know, Prime Minister Ishiba was in Taipei last year, met with Lai Ching-te. He's been a supporter of Taiwan for a long time. And I think this is an area where, you know, frankly, he knows the Taiwanese leadership better than most Americans do, since American political leaders can't actually go and meet with their counterparts. And so with those 6 economies, I think the U.S. and Japan have been making a lot of progress. In the rest of the region, I would say Japan has done fairly well, but across both the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, I think we've struggled. And we should be honest with ourselves about that. If you look at polling data in most of Southeast Asia, it's quite negative for the United States. And it's due to a variety of factors, some of which came up earlier today. It's due to frustration about lack of access to the U.S. market. It's due to a feeling that the U.S. is not willing to engage consistently because both of the last 2 administrations haven't shown up to a fair amount of Southeast Asian meetings, the U.S.-ASEAN summits, et cetera. We've often sent lower-level delegations. And so these issues have hurt our standing in Southeast Asia in a way that I think is really damaging. Now, this is an area where Japan is still doing quite well. If you just look at the polling data and you say who's the most trusted partner in Southeast Asia by quite a mile, it's Japan. And part of that's the economic engagement, part of that's sustained diplomatic engagement, and really listening to what Southeast Asians want. So the good news story is I don't think we're going to see a lot of change from this. Why? It's not because the Joe Biden administration and the first Donald Trump administration had the same strategy. It's because they had the same structural constraints. So the U.S. is going to keep doing well with countries that are concerned about Chinese behavior, and I think we're going to struggle in most of the rest of the region. And so for Japan, I think part of the task is how do you explain in Asia the value of the United States, even if, frankly, the U.S. is not always great at doing this ourselves? And how do you demonstrate to the United States the value of staying engaged, as you noted, Satoru, and why Asian security, Asian prosperity is so important to American security and American prosperity? So I think that's the overall framework that I would have to think about this, is that there are huge structural constraints, and those aren't going to change anytime soon. The second point I would make going forward is the U.S.-Japan relationship is going to have to come back to economics, right? This is what President Trump cares most about. He's been very clear. And I think Japan has already done a great job at this. You know, it's talking about the $800 billion of Japanese investment in the United States, trying to get to $1 trillion, 1 million American jobs that are supported by Japanese investment. And I think the next question is, okay, what else can we do? And that's a tough question because it's often a question for businesses more than government. But there's going to have to be a government role to all of this also. And so, other governments have been trotting out some of their business leaders to do a lot of this heavy lifting. TSMC's CEO was just announcing a big investment in the United States. Japan has had one similar case from SoftBank, which is its own particular investor. But I think the next step is probably to see what some large Japanese companies are going to do in terms of investment in the United States, what kind of projects they're excited by. And, frankly, that's going to depend a little bit on the business environment here. I think many of those companies will be excited about cutting regulation, but they will want to have a little bit more confidence about the direction of the U.S. economy, and about how foreign investments are going to be viewed in the United States. And so what happens with the Nippon Steel deal, I think, will be important to many of them. So I think recentering economic issues as part of the U.S.-Japan alliance is going to be just increasingly important. So that's the second point. Third point is just a couple of areas where I think we're going to have to pay renewed attention and where we might have to think a little differently about how to manage some challenges in the year ahead. The first on my list is Taiwan. Joe Biden clearly thought of Taiwan as sort of a democratic outpost in Asia, and he was quite clear 4 times saying he would defend it. I think the Trump administration has been clear that they want to reassess. And when President Trump was asked if he wanted to make a statement on Taiwan recently, he said no, he would keep that information private. And I think the risk that some of us see is President Trump seems to think a little bit in terms of spheres of influence in Europe. And that's certainly how he talks sometimes about Russia, as if it should have some sort of sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. He hasn't talked much about East Asia, but I think the question that many Japanese and Taiwanese will want to ask is, what would a sphere of influence for China look like in East Asia? Does it include Taiwan? Does it include Japan, Korea, on down the line? So I think the Trump administration will have to do some efforts to explain what their logic is in East Asia. Like, what's the security approach? And if it's a sphere of influence logic, what does that mean for U.S. allies and partners in the region? The second flashpoint that I just point to very quickly, you mentioned already, Satoru, is Korea. And here you talked about North Korea. I'm just going to say a word about South Korea. I think there's a real risk that South Korea will develop or get pretty far down the line of developing its own independent nuclear capability. It lives in a tough neighborhood. North Korea, China are doing massive nuclear modernization programs, and Russia is making nuclear threats. And meanwhile, it's watching as some European countries are talking about proliferating themselves. If South Korea were to develop nuclear weapons, that would, I think, be a game changer in Asia, but particularly for Japan. And so in the alliance context, I think we'll have to think in a new way and frankly, a little bit unsettling way about what South Korean proliferation would mean. And then just one final point, and then I'll hand it back to you, Jeffrey, which is, as we do this, I think continuing to have a clear vision about where we want the alliance to go is so important. And General Rupp laid out so cleanly what the tasks are now, and there's a lot of work to do. And a lot of this is hard work. It's about changing bureaucracies and organizational cultures and reporting lines. It's going to be challenging, and it takes a lot of knowledge and sustained effort, and it's not going to make a lot of headlines. And so I think one of the real issues that we're going to have on U.S.-Japan security relations the next few years is some of the flashy stuff has been done. The announcement about getting towards 2% of GDP on defense, that's done. But a lot of the quiet, hard work that's going to happen below the waterline may not make headlines. And we Americans are going to have to understand that that's still progress, and it's important progress. And even if it's not making Fox News Chiron every couple of days, it's things that is going to help us in warfighting if we need it. And I think the expert community will have to be able to explain this in a simple way to people on the street so that they understand what's happening on the alliance. So that's going to be sort of, I think, a task for all of us going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. As introduced, I'm Ayumi Teraoka from Columbia University. Again, I just echo thanks for all the organization for making this event possible. Thank you, Jeffrey, for organizing this. Delighted to be here. I'm tasked to talk about regional responses to the new leadership in Washington, but I should really start by saying how much of progress the U.S. Japan bilateral alliance has made over time. It's an incredibly stable and rock-solid relationship that we currently see. But at the same time, the function of U.S.-Japan alliance is not about bilateral relationship only. The other half of the responsibility or mission of the U.S.-Japan alliance is to preserve peace and stability in the Far East. So it's by nature, it's a regional public good, and that's why we also have to worry about how the region is reacting to U.S. leadership or U.S.-Japan policies to the region. When we think about region, which is the states in Indo-Pacific region, I think there are broadly three categories of states. First is 5 U.S. treaty allies, so Japan, Korea, Australia, Philippines, and Thailand. And sort of informal security partner, Taiwan. So those countries are looking to new leadership in Washington and thinking about the credibility of U.S. commitment, reliability of U.S. as a security guarantor, both on conventional terms and nuclear terms. Second category of states are not treaty allies, but strategic partners of the United States, and they're mostly vibrant developing economies and leader of sort of global south. And this is really the engine of growth in Asia. So Vietnam, Singapore, Indonesia, and India probably falls under this category too. And they're really evaluating whether U.S. will be committed to providing public goods to the region, whether they're going to help their economy and then feed their people and create jobs for the growth that the leaders expected to provide for their own people. And then they also kind of trying to see if U.S. will be a credible counterbalance against Chinese influence in the region, because they would like to preserve their autonomy, sovereignty in the region, and they really need a counterbalance against the very big, powerful partner in the region, China. And the third category of states in the region, of course, are those states that keep us off balance. So keep us off balance also China, North Korea, and Russia. So they're watching to see if the new United States leadership would make their strategic environment better or worse, whether they make it easier for them to achieve what they want out of the region and establish the order in a way that serves their interest. So I was just going to go through the list to see how they're evaluating. Of course, everything that's coming out of the news is still too early to tell their implications. You know, I don't think nobody should really jump to conclusion of what's going to happen, depending on each news cycle. But I can say that the first group of states, U.S. allies and partners, through formal, informal security arrangement, they're really watching what's happening in Ukraine and see if this proposition that today's Ukraine is tomorrow's East Asia actually will hold. So that's the proposition that Prime Minister Kishida stated to advocate for support for Ukraine. But now that Washington is trying to bring peace to the Ukraine conflict, they are trying to see if this proposition will still hold. So if Washington is trying to bring peace to Ukraine, they're also watching how Washington will bring peace. And if there are any inferences that they can draw from how U.S. is also going to approach the possible conflict in Asia. And we don't know yet. That's a really good question to ask, but we should just consider that question in our mind, whether how U.S. would approach Europe would also be applicable to how U.S. Would approach Asia. And there are enough signals that the proposition might not hold, because there are many people in the Trump administration that call for more resources to go into Asia. And I think that there is a broad consensus still in Washington that China is the biggest strategic challenge posed to the United States. But at the same time, this fundamental anxiety that allies have in any parts of the world when U.S. is shifting priority theater from one to the another, either from Middle East to Asia or Europe to Asia, there's always a concern among Asian allies that if U.S. can just flip back and forth, maybe U.S. would also shift away from Asia in the future. I don't know if it's to a different region or to just isolationist United States. It was a phenomenon that we saw when Obama administration was putting forward this concept of pivot to Asia. And pivot to Asia was sort of as a concept renamed to rebalance, because pivot also implies that U.S. might pivot away from Asia in the future. So this staying power is always concerned. One of the sort of reassuring signals, though, is this continued presence of U.S. military in the region and increasing activities that U.S. Service members are still conducting in the region. Just recently, they had a South China Sea exercise with the UK and Australia. I think just this week, they're also doing some anti-submarine warfare exercises in the region, in Guam, Hawaii, and to these exercises, India, Australia, Japan, are all participating. So these substantial activities that U.S. military still holds is a sign of credible reassurance from United States. There comes also U.S. Japan's joint statement, in which, as other speakers noted, there was a mention about the importance of free and open Indo-Pacific. There was a mention about the importance of U.S. Japan ROK trilateral cooperation, and then also stability and peace in the Taiwan Strait. So this statement was incredibly important. The implications were profound because not many foreign leaders were able to visit White House just yet. Australian leaders still hasn't visited there. India's Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister of Japan, Ishiba, are the only two sort of Indo-Pacific leaders who made it to the White House and had a joint statements. Korea is having its own political turmoil, so it doesn't have a representative to directly engage with Mr. Trump. And so the fact that North Korea was mentioned in the joint statement, and the fact that U.S.-Japan ROK trilateral cooperation was reinforced as an important mechanism was really assuring for those observers in Seoul. And I think the same goes for Taiwan. Taiwan, of course, for its own special reasons, doesn't have the diplomatic engagement or access into the White House sometimes. So I think it's important to note that Japan has sort of its own responsibility when it engages with the United States. It also should represent the region and diverse opinions of what the region wants out of the United States. So there are many, worrisome signals, but also reassuring signals that kind of show the continued commitment from the United States to the region. And then there goes another second layer of states, which are non-U.S. treaty allies. And some of the news or development coming out of White House, like cutting foreign aid, is a frowned upon activity because these countries are beneficiary of U.S. foreign aid, and it kind of signals that U.S. might not be interested in providing public goods to the region. And these economies of Asia really want investment to grow and provide a better infrastructure for the people. And Chinese are always there to provide more money and are there to kind of fill in the vacuum to provide more money, but it might come with political attachment. And then so that puts a pressure on leaders in this region for having to rely on Chinese financial incentives. Here, I think Japan, South Korea, who have interest and years of experience in providing quality financial, quality investment for quality infrastructure development, should really coordinate among each other to provide a layer of assurance to the region that it's not just the United States, but other states also provide a lot of assistance to the region.
And then we should also think about how these allies can coordinate on strategic communication to say that it's, even if U.S. might change policies at some point, but there are staying power provided by advanced economies of Asia. And if you combine, for example, South Korean and Japanese foreign direct investment in Southeast Asia, that's more than what China provides. So we should really work on sort of strategic messaging to the region, that it's not just U.S.-China competition, it's the U.S. and U.S. like-minded states on the one side and China on the other. Lastly, I should talk about what China is doing to seize opportunities that are presented to itself. As we could see from Foreign Minister Wang Yi's statements in the UN, China has been active, first of all, in international organizations like United Nations for a long time, but I think now they're really trying to seize opportunities to play up the fear of abandonment that many regional states have in the region, so that China can strengthen and solidify its viewpoint and position within various global organizations. Foreign Minister Wang Yi has also been approaching to countries like Japan to drive a wedge in these coalitions. I think from China's perspective, being able to drive a wedge in the U.S. Japan alliance is like a huge victory because they see Japan playing such a big role in the region. As everybody this morning and this afternoon has illustrated, Japan is a really fundamental pillar in many of these unilateral frameworks. So if they can just get Japan on their board, that's a huge plus. So Foreign Minister Wang Yi has met with Foreign Minister Iwaya last December. There's a lot of talk about Mr. Wang Yi visiting Tokyo. That hasn't happened yet. There's also a discussion about President Xi going to Tokyo in the future. She hasn't visited Tokyo yet. And China has also removed the buoy that they set up in East China Sea, and they also unilaterally removed it. On the other hand, they also unilaterally imposed sanctions on Japanese seafood, and they're now unilaterally lifting it. So they're trying to really create favors to present some political setting for Tokyo to come on board and to engage diplomatically with China. But at the same time, I think many observers in the region and in Tokyo know that China hasn't really changed its foreign policy directions. So, there are also expanding activities, military activities around the region, constantly pressuring on Japanese borders. I think somebody in the audience also raised there was a live fire activities in between New Zealand and Australia. So I think the region is resilient enough against these pressures or charm offensives coming from Beijing that Chinese foreign policy hasn't really changed, despite the fact that they are trying to curry favors and sort of present diplomatic warming to these capitals. China is not significantly more assuring all of a sudden. So I think I am very confident the region will stick together, and then rather than just changing their position on China's threat, they will probably perhaps take opportunities presented by Beijing to meet and do a diplomatic engagement with Beijing. But at the same time, I think they would also talk among themselves about future political strategic cooperation that they could do among themselves, Japan and other like-minded countries. So I think we should propose these various capitals in the region to strengthen their partnerships and exchange notes about where U.S. is headed, China is headed, and then really create layers of cooperation on security, economic security, so that they can assure each other that they have their back. Whenever they engage with China, they can exchange notes. When they negotiate with United States on some issues that is really important to the region, if they can collaborate amongst each other, they can also collectively leverage themselves on United States. So I think that's the sort of direction that region is headed. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. Okay, as before, I will open up with a few questions as you start to think about the questions you want to ask. I want to start, so China came up by all of you. It was peppered throughout. So I'm going to start by asking a question that I want you all to address, and then a second question tacked on that I'll separate out. So the question that's for all of you is, how do you think China views the U.S. Japan alliance? Like how does it see the alliance? That's the question for all of you. The second question tacked on is, I'll put Satoru and Ayumi into one bucket and Zach in the other. What kind of security relationship does Japan want with China? And then for Zach, what kind of relationship does the U.S. want with China? So I'll start with Satoru, and we'll just work our way down.
So I'll first of all answer your first question about how is China viewing the Japan-U.S. alliance. I think increasingly with this new picture of U.S.-China competition, I think essentially China's view of Japan is that it's an extension of the U.S. Influence in the region, and it plays a significant role. And the alliance itself is a way for the United States to project various kinds of influence in the region. And as time passes, they recognize some of the new defense cooperation efforts, particularly after 2022 National Security Strategy, National Defense Strategy. I do think they see a significant development in the U.S.-Japan alliance as a sort of a way for the United States to contain China. And Japan is an instrument of trying to do that. That's probably the way they see it. And I think they increasingly see that Japan's becoming very much vocal with regard to issues like East China Sea, South China Sea, and Taiwan. They don't like this development because it's actually sort of encouraging in a way for Japan to be more vocal on these regional security issues. So in any case, they do not like the developments in this area. And I really liked your framing the other day about U.S.-Japan becoming the hub of the region. And I think they see the U.S.-Japan plus approach, this regional lattice work, coalition building effort as very, very sort of a competitive approach towards China. So everything that comes out of the alliance, China pretty much hates to see happen because it undermines their way of trying to expand influence in the region. So that's the way I think China is viewing the alliance. Should I address the second one? Okay, yeah. What kind of security relationship does Japan want to see established with China? I just want to, before going into the security relationship, I want to address the diplomatic dimension. Ayumi briefly addressed this, China's way of trying to drive a wedge between Japan and the United States. And the reason why it's not working is that some of the sort of China's actions like walking back on the Fukushima treated water issue and reopening the import of Japanese seafood, and also loosening restrictions on visa and things like this, is that Japan does not see this as a sort of a good faith action. They should not have done it in the first place. That's our view, basically. So it doesn't appear to us as something as a sort of a bona fide relationship improving action. But nevertheless, we did reciprocate by relaxing our own visa restrictions for tourists coming from China. But so what they do actually does not make us sort of distance ourselves from the United States. It doesn't really have that effect on the diplomatic side. On the security relationship, Japan would want a security relationship with China that would be free of coercion. So this is going to be like no ships around Senkaku Islands, no coercion against Taiwan, and no unilateral actions in the East China Sea and South China Sea. And also, Japan would also like to see the slowing down of and more transparency with regard to China's military buildup. And essentially, Japan and the United States is, because of this China's arms buildup, what we are actually doing is trying to forge a multinational balancing effort against China. Not only with this minilaterals in the region, but also we're reaching out to the Europeans as well. I mean, we see AUKUS and other various kinds of European security cooperation efforts, IP4 engagement with NATO, for example. And so this is a way for Japan to sort of send a signal to China that arms buildup is not going to deliver a Chinese military dominance in the Western Pacific. And ultimately, I think our justifiable sort of cause for doing this kind of defense cooperation efforts is to ultimately compel China to get on board an arms control negotiation, because we don't want to go to a sort of a limitless, unconditional arms race in the future. But this is not going to happen unless Taiwan issue is resolved. So I'm not having any optimism on this front. But nevertheless, I think what we want to see happen is for China to realize that spending on sort of this kind of arms race is not going to be beneficial for neither China or the other regional states. And for that to sort of change, so we want to see China change course and be less aggressive on those arms buildup, and also moderate their behavior in the Western Pacific. So that's the kind of security relationship I think we want to see happen in the region. Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on Satoru, your comment about how the U.S. Japan alliance is seen from Beijing. I think it's seen as a relic of the past, and our job is to convince friends in China that that's not right, and that the U.S. Japan alliance is going to be here for a long time, and that they just have to accept that fact. And deal with us with that as sort of an assumption going forward. Easier said than done. The harder question then, Jeffrey, is the one you asked, which is, what's the U.S. want from China? And I don't think the Chinese have any idea, to be candid. I mean, in talking with Chinese diplomats at a fairly senior level, this is the question they ask me, is what does the U.S. want? And I certainly don't have a clear answer. I think if you were to read past U.S. strategic concepts about China from the last two administrations, it's not really clear. The Biden administration said that it wanted to compete with China. That was sort of the strategic element that it put forward. But what the balance was between cooperation and, an adversarial relationship was never really clear. And the Trump administration in the first term had some competing views, right? The White House put out a strategy in 2020 that suggested that the U.S. should accept that the Communist Party is the government of China, and that we should try and convince the Communist Party to adjust its behavior in certain areas like intellectual property theft and Taiwan and on down the line. And then Mike Pompeo at the State Department put out their own major China strategy, which suggested a fundamental change in the form of government in China. And I think Chinese watching this have probably come to the right conclusion, which is that Americans don't know exactly what we want. And so, the Trump administration sort of comes into this in the second term with a little baggage which isn't of their own making, which is that Chinese don't know what Americans want because the last two administrations haven't been, I think, clear themselves. And I have to say, listening to what President Trump has said, I don't think it's clear yet that they have a strategy. I think they'll get there over time, but I think it's going to take a while. And my guess is that there are two quite different views within the administration. One of which is that the U.S., as Ayumi was saying, should prioritize East Asia because China is the biggest threat in the world, and that we really need to force China to adjust its behavior on a whole range of economic issues, on security issues like Taiwan. But there's a second view, which is quite strong in this administration, which suggests that actually the U.S., I think, needs to pay more attention on the Americas and maybe less than the rest of the world, which might be willing to allow China to have a little bit more influence in East Asia if it played by certain economic rules. And I just don't think we know yet which of those two directions the administration is going to go. And let's be honest, we're not even 2 months in here yet. So the tough work of writing a national security strategy and socializing that with the president and the rest of the agencies hasn't really happened yet. But my guess is that this is going to be what the Chinese are trying to sense out over the next few months. And I think the time that we're going to find out the most might come soon if Xi Jinping and Donald Trump meet in person, as has been rumored. I think that'll tell us a lot about what President Trump says about what he wants from China. And until then, I think the jury's still out.
I would just echo everything that has been said by my friends and colleagues. But I do think that China does see Japan to be taking a very leadership role in the region to form a coalition of like-minded states that they just don't like. That shows that Japan is doing something right. I mean, it's really taking a leadership role, but at the same time, it really pokes China's eyes and kind of convinces them that Japan is an annoying player in the region. So they want to try various things to see, especially now that Abe's gone, Abe's successors are gone, and the Ishiba cabinet seems like a new leadership type that has been a little bit distant from Abe administration. They're trying to see if the Japanese leadership might respond differently to various types of diplomatic maneuvers. And it's not working. But they're still nonetheless trying because they kind of lost all the leverage that they used to have within Japanese domestic politics. That doesn't mean that they can stop working on Japan. So they will try various things and really want to warn Japanese that they shouldn't support Taiwan's independence, and they send messages that various types of support that Japanese society gives to Taiwan is only kind of fearing support for independence forces in Taiwan. That's a narrative, and then want to picture Japan to be a sort of irresponsible actor supporting Taiwan's independence, which is not the case. But there has been a huge delegation of Diet members going to Taiwan's inauguration ceremony. So Japan is present and does work closely with Taiwanese society. So that's definitely being noticed. So I think that China does feel that U.S. Japan alliance is strong, and therefore they have to keep working on it. What Japan wants out of China, I think I echo what Satoru was saying. Really wants China to be a responsible player in the region. That doesn't always rely on military coercion or economic coercion. And at the same time, I think Tokyo wants to maintain strategic dialogues and sort of line of communications with Beijing, because I know that within even China, there are various opinions within China, and oftentimes change within authoritarian system comes from within. So I think Tokyo will continue to engage with Beijing. When there is any convincing signals that China is changing its course of action, I think Tokyo should respond warmly. But until that happens, I think Tokyo should maintain line of communications and various diplomatic channels so that Japan has a good intelligence on what's happening, what kind of discourse is happening within China.
Ask a separate question to each of you. And I'll start this time with Ayumi, go to Satoru, and I'll end with Zach. Ayumi, your question, you mentioned briefly about sort of what's happening in Seoul, politics. The question to you is, how does what's happened with President Yoon, how does that affect the U.S. Japan alliance? Like, what is the implications that we should care about? Satoru, briefly, you mentioned it, but I want to draw back to the first panel this morning. How does the weakening yen affect Japan's defense buildup and the 7 priorities that you laid out? And then, Zach, I know that you just mentioned there's no strategy yet, but what do you see as the possible core elements of the developing U.S. strategy for the Indo-Pacific region? So I'll start with Ayumi.
Great, thank you so much. Former President Yoon's use of martial law was deplorable, I think, from even Tokyo's point of view, because ROK, is Japan's like-minded state. But at the same time, all the constitutional processes that are happening right now, impeachment trial, are done very carefully, judiciously, and that's a positive sign that democratic resilience is still there in Korea. I would not be too pessimistic about the future of South Korean foreign policy being completely different from President Yoon's foreign policy. I think many Koreans view President Yoon's foreign policy to be positive legacy than negative. There was a lot of concerns that President Yoon was giving up too much and then compromising much to give Japan a good negotiation position without getting a lot more concessions from Tokyo. But nonetheless, I think people in Korea support Korea to be part of Indo-Pacific sort of coalition, like-minded states, doing more in Southeast Asia, different regions, and be an active global player. So that's, I think, there's a consistency I hope to see in the future. I think opposition parties candidate, there are still moving parts. Even if we have an opposition leader to be the president of South Korea, advisory members might not represent the previous progressive foreign policy point of view. So I am actually more optimistic about Korea's future as an Indo-Pacific player. And structurally speaking, I think there's a lot more incentive for ROK to also work with Japan and other like-minded states. So I would caution observers in Tokyo to kind of have a very rigid view of what the progressive foreign policy in Korea means. Because having sort of colored judgment would only cloud our actual perception. And really try to work with Korea and to promote our common visions in the region.
Okay, how does the weakening yen affect Japan's defense buildup? I think the most straightforward answer would be that it would affect Japan's acquisition and procurement of foreign weapon systems, including missiles, munitions, and parts of various sorts. So I think that's going to have a pressure, sort of limit the quantity of how much we can procure with regard to those systems. I think the broader implication is that it also creates opportunities for Japan's defense article transfer export. I think with the weaker yen, we will be able to, ship things with relatively cheaper price compared to a strong yen situation. So right now, I think there is sort of a beginning of a discussion about reviewing the principles regarding defense article export right now. I'm not quite sure whether I'm allowed to sort of disclose some of the discussions that I had with the LDP special committee, but there are movements within the Japanese expert community, probably among some politicians, about removing some of the restrictions there. And conventionally, we were prohibited from exporting defense articles to countries that are involved in conflict. But obviously with the Ukraine situation, I think there are certain situations, we realize that there are certain situations under which Japan would be justified in providing lethal aid to countries that are being subjected to aggression. So in that case, I think it's better for Japan to remove that kind of restriction. And also, I think one of the main Japan security the expansion of Japan's security role in the region is to support regional countries' defense buildup by exporting Japan's weapon systems. And here, until now, we have this very strict regulation where they have to do an approval process on a case-by-case basis. But I think one other way to sort of facilitate this procedure would be to sort of approve certain recipient country. And then once you approve that a certain country is eligible to receive Japanese defense article export, then we should facilitate all subsequent export of individual items. And those are some of the ways through which I think Japan would be able to sort of capitalize on the current situation with the weak yen. But we'll have to see whether that would be politically feasible. I think the July upper house election, until then, I would not expect to see a sort of dramatic departure from the Ishiba government to undertake a new initiative. But after the elections, every time we talk about a post-election initiative, and sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. So we'll have to see how things unfold after summer.
Yeah, Jeffrey, on what the key elements are of the Trump administration's security approach, I think there's one basic logic, which is the Trump administration wants to be aligned with countries that it sees as helping themselves. And so with Japan stepping up, that's kind of an easy choice, right? And I'll put the economic issues to the side for now, because I think a country like Japan can work through those with the United States. India, I think, is in a similar category, stepping up, helping itself. I think the challenge in the rest of the region is countries that have a lot of work to do, like the Philippines, which traditionally just hasn't spent a lot of its economic production on defense, and is therefore very reliant on the United States. And, I think President Trump has been very clear that he thinks that there's a deal to be made, and he doesn't like the United States being the protector of its allies. He wants the allies to do a lot more than they've done in the past. And where countries are already doing that, like in Japan or Australia or Korea, where spending is either relatively high or increasing, I think the message is pretty clear to the Trump administration. I think the places where it's more difficult is the Philippines or Taiwan, right? Which, let's be honest, if Taiwan spent 100% of its GDP on defense, it still wouldn't be enough given the size of the People's Liberation Army. But I think Donald Trump understandably wants to see a signal from Taipei that Taiwan is pushing hard to get its house in order on defense. And the fact that, unfortunately, the Legislative Yuan is kind of tied up in trying to decide whether to spend a little bit more money on defense, that's going to be a challenge. So I think for the president, his top metric, as it has been in Europe, is, who's stepping up, percent of GDP. It might not be our favorite measure, but I think that's what his administration is going to use as the first approximation. And it's both about the level of spending, but also about the trend.
Okay. Do we have questions in the audience? So we have a lot of questions. Let me start with the lady right. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you for your insightful discussion. I'm a rising senior at KU University and also student of Professor Mori, so I hope not to embarrass him or myself. But so I realized that General Zup also talked about how security relations continue despite political tensions, but I want to hear more about the discrepancies, if there are, between Japan and the U.S. regarding like how they view the world and multilateral relations, and how they will lead the world as allies, and whether those political tensions in terms of values will generate any tensions like internally or regarding like future concerns, especially in regards to the connectivity between the Asian sphere and the European sphere, as former Prime Minister Kishida talked about.
Okay, let's take one more question. I'll take the gentleman in the back. I'm sorry, back there in the corner.
I want to thank y'all for coming out today. Appreciate them. Y'all give a hand up for these people here today. I want to say y'all already, that's the same question that we just answered during the last, during the morning time. It's the global piece through music diplomacy, like with Dolly Parton and so on and so forth. I think what's happening is we spending too much time, like even though like It used to be the bullet or the ballot. We're just gonna fight our way out this situation. We're gonna vote our way out this situation. As a soldier, I used to think like that. I learned that with the answer. It's always gonna be a peace treaty. That's always a marriage. You can't get over it. But even at the end of the day, even with that though, we're spending too much time trying to invest in things that's not hot. Sometimes you can't make stuff hot that's not hot. And sometimes it's just like a lecture. It's not the fact that you don't know. Maybe it takes a long time to read all them books. You hear me? It took me months to read all this stuff. It's just in her. But well, it's the global peace through diplomacy initiative, man. It's easy, man. Anybody in the world can do it. Some people just ain't got talent. That's why Hollywood, they be like, look, some people got it, some people don't, man. You know what I'm saying? Some people got skill, some people don't. And sometimes I think we're too scared to tell people the truth because we want to draw these false narratives and invest all this money in these people sometimes, and it never works out. Okay. Sometimes just let what's hot be hot and what's not, you hear me? Hey, tell them, hey, just let's create new products, man.
Thank you.
The answer, though. Same answer, man.
Thank you.
9 marriages, 9 married, 2 services. Better marriage.
Okay, so one question about the importance of diplomacy. The other question.
Okay, regarding the question about the possible tension between United States and Japan regarding regarding global outlook as well as values, right? I think that was the question. I think, as Jack mentioned during his initial remarks, Japan used to use this phrase, free and open international order based on the rule of law. And this phrase was actually dropped from the joint communique, a joint statement of Japan and the United States. And I don't think Japan and the United States necessarily have to sort of come together having a completely same vision for international order. I think, as I mentioned earlier, Japan right now, instead of talking about a sort of a very abstract, rather abstract concept about what kind of order that we want to pursue, I think we are trying to identify areas of practical cooperation right now in area of defense, in area of economics, and possibly in other areas. And for example, if we have differences in the way we think about foreign aid, and United States is sort of drastically reducing its foreign aid and shutting down U.S. aid and so forth. It's not that Japan's going to sort of confront the United States about the necessity of this program, but rather I think Japan's trying to pick up some of the programs that has been shut down by the United States and probably cooperate with the Europeans about how to sort of fill in the gap and so forth. So rather than sort of take this issue and make it into a sort of a tension and a friction issue, I think Japan's way of dealing with this issue would be to sort of take a complementary approach by picking up some of the work that has been left undone by the United States. And otherwise, I think one other issue that I think might become a sort of a very contentious between the United States and the Japanese government and the U.S. administration could be the way a sort of a final deal that might come out from the Ukraine issue. And the reason why I say this is that for us, I think it's possible, it might be necessary for many countries, including Ukraine and European states and other states, to sort of come to a ceasefire agreement where where Russia is de facto occupying illegally occupied territory. But if a final deal actually says that we have to actually recognize Russian sovereignty over illegally occupied Ukrainian territory, that's not going to be acceptable for Japan or other like-minded countries that have been supporting Ukraine. So if that comes to the fore, I think it's going to be very contentious. And it's going to be up to each government's decision how to sort of deal and whether to try to convince the Trump administration to sort of walk back on that kind of position. And I think that's the way Japan and maybe European states who do not want to see that kind of outcome might have to sort of persuade and convince the Trump administration that that kind of outcome is actually going to send the wrong signal to East Asia, because it would be essentially communicating to other revisionist powers that if you grab a certain land, then the United States would recognize that, and that's not the way international order is going to be sustained. And I think that's one of the bottom line issues that I think Japan and other like-minded countries would not want to concede. So, but otherwise, I think In other areas, I think Japan would likely sort of pursue its own value-based diplomacy by engaging in foreign assistance. We'll probably cooperate with Europeans on many issues and many programs that require value-shared cooperation. So I'll stop at that. Yeah.
I'll just make one really quick comment about what I think ties elements of both questions together, which is, that I think the Trump administration in some ways can be refreshing. They're asking basic questions, and sometimes we in the strategic community kind of pass over those as if we already know the answers. And we don't always know the answers, in fact. And so, I think some of the questions they're asking, like, why should we be doing this with that country? These are entirely fair questions to ask, and sometimes, we jump over these sort of first principles questions. I think the challenge is going to be there are elements of what we do that when you turn it off can't be turned on so easily again. And so the question for the Trump administration is, how many of these things do you actually want to turn off all the way, and how many do you want to threaten to turn off and see if it makes a difference and then turn back on before, the people go find other jobs or the projects are fully canceled. I think this is a really hard question. And I don't think there's an easy answer. I think there's a little bit of the learning that is going on right now with the Trump team where, we saw some of the stories about the cabinet meetings the last few days where, I think the instinct from some of the administration is to just turn everything off, and then if it has to be turned back on, it will be. And then there are others who are saying, no, you start with what you have, and then you sort of do surgery to cut out the parts that you don't need. It's a philosophical question. And I think they're just going to have to work their way through this. But it's as somebody in Washington, it's a little unsteady to see this process. But it's unsteady in part because it's the opposite of the way we usually do this, which we just assume that everything we're doing is right, and then we add on to that. So, I think that element of what the Trump administration is doing is causing some real consternation, understandably. But hopefully where they end up is in a place where we've sort of rethought about some of the assumptions we had going in.
As other speakers have noted, Indo-Pacific freedom and open Indo-Pacific order without coercion is originally a Japanese concept. So Japan should proceed with it, with or without United States. And I think there are many allies that Japan has that supports that concept. So the fact that U.S. is having its reconsideration of where, how it wants to conduct foreign policy shouldn't deter Japan or its like-minded states to proceed what they believe in. So the Trump administration might not be so interested in multilateralism. President Trump would like to proceed on bilateral deals. So I think Japan should proceed with bilateral deal with United States and then maintain high-level trust. But Japan should also keep going at those multilateral frameworks. And we all know that U.S. domestic politics is a very polarized state right now. So U.S. might come back at these multilateral engagement, and when that happens, we can also just welcome back United States. So I think that's the sort of we can't really wait to just pause on these diplomatic initiatives that Japan has been working for a long, long time because we have such a tremendous challenge coming from Beijing. So we'll just keep running what we have now, and hope for U.S. engagement in these multilateral forums, again, because U.S. is a tremendous global power. And I think that's the mentality that Tokyo will continue to have, and it will keep at both bilateral engagement and then multilateral engagement to pursue FOIP in Indo-Pacific. Thanks.
I'll take another couple questions. I think we have one, Nikolai.
Yes, I think one question came in as Dr. Cooper and Dr. Teraoka were speaking, specifically assuming that certain levers, certain mechanisms between Japan and US are turned off, assuming new administration comes after Trump, would Japan be likely to reignite the relationship with the US, or do we have any indicators of that?
Okay.
If they were to be closed off.
Okay, I'll do then one question here in the front, and then David over there.
Thank you for the discussion. And I have a question on Dr. Zach Cooper's comment. You mentioned that because the U.S. doesn't have exact strategy on China, and because also Trump like the notion of sphere of influence, he may compromise or concession about China and accept the sphere of influence of China. And from Japanese perspective, I have a question. What can Japan done in order to avoid that disastrous situation? Thank you.
Okay, and then last question over there.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Before asking my question, I want to take a moment to remember that 14 years ago tomorrow, Japan experienced the most devastating natural disaster. But how it relates to what we are here today is the fact that both the Japan Self-Defense Force and our U.S. military jointly through Operation Tomodachi, made such a big impact on not just the alliance or the relationship, as for example that the U.S. Air Force were one of the first individuals to arrive into Sendai Airport to reopen that airport in 30 days. We have the Reagan Strike Group, where Consul General Sone was fortunate enough to meet the skipper of the USS Ronald Reagan, and one of the helicopter commanders who actually brought humanitarian relief. But it's because of this alliance that Operation Tomodachi was very successful. Now for my question. In this unpredictable, predictable administration, Europe recently concluded a study where it would take 300,000 troops or 250 billion euros to backfill any withdrawal of U.S. forces in Europe. Has Japan conducted any study what impact in terms of manpower needs of Japan's Self-Defense Force and fiscal budgetary from the Ministry of Defense would be required to backfill in this environment? Thank you.
Let's, I'll start with Ayumi and we'll come this way. And take the ones that, you don't have to answer them all, but you can take the ones you want to.
Okay, great. So the online question was how Japan is preparing for the future U.S. administration and how to find the points of leverage to influence U.S. policy. Okay. U.S. is still an open society. There are many levels of politics that take place in the United States. There are various state politics. There are various senators. So I think Japan and U.S. relationship has developed so extensively that Japanese diplomats and U.S.-Japan engagement happens in every state across the United States. So I think Japan will try to kind of work at presenting the importance of U.S.-Japan alliance in multiple levels of U.S. politics to influence or educate or let other people inform in American society. So I think that's the levers I think that often U.S. allies find is that Americans are open to information and engagement with outside world. I do not know whether there's a study. I think it's always an important question. What if? Every ally should think about, because that also leads to appreciation of U.S. presence in the region. But I think the Asian allies are watching quietly about how Europeans are trying to take up more roles to secure defense for Europe. I think Asian allies should also invest more on their defense and work amongst each other to have a little more layers of security frameworks rather than just being reliant on the United States. That doesn't say that U.S. presence is not guaranteed. U.S. still might be there and still committed ally. But still, I think the more robust relationship that U.S. allies have among themselves will lead to even healthier relationship with the United States also.
Maybe I'll just focus on this question about how the United States can be, persuaded to stay engaged in East Asia. And look, I think if we step back, it makes sense that Americans are asking this question. You know, after World War II, you'd had Americans fighting twice in world wars in 25 years. And so the idea of making huge sacrifices for other people around the world made sense because we weren't sacrificing for them. We realized that actually if we were present around the world in key places, that could make conflict less likely and we wouldn't have to be as likely to intervene again. And I think that lasted through the Cold War. Now, for people of my generation, what they mostly remember is the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think they say, well, maybe we didn't have to fight those conflicts, right? And I think that's a natural question to ask. And, you know, the people of the generation who fought in World War II, they're largely passing from the scene. And so the problem is we don't have people that have understood so deeply the costs of not being as engaged internationally. We have a lot of people who've seen how expensive it can be and how ineffective the U.S. can be at times. So I think there's a little bit of a crisis of confidence in the United States. And we have to remind ourselves that actually we've done some good in places. And East Asia is a place that looks pretty darn good. I mean, think about what East Asia looked like 80 years ago, and now where we have had substantial troop presences in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. I mean, these are places that are absolutely flourishing. Like, this has worked. And so I think this is part of the story that we're going to have to tell. And Japan may have to be part of reminding Americans that actually there are times that we can do good. Doesn't mean that we should do everything everywhere all at once, but it does mean that when we pick places that can be priorities, we can make a difference.
I just wanted to echo Zach's point about, you know, when we talk about deep engagement, there's a tendency to sort of focus on the negative side and the cost side only. But I think it's really necessary to look at the whole balance sheet and look at the brighter side, how much U.S. has benefited from deep engagement. I think there tends to be less focus on that aspect of U.S. deep engagement, but I think when we talk about whether U.S. should be engaging other regions, we should look at it in a more holistic way, not only focus on the costs, but also the benefits that the United States has actually accrued through engaging East Asia and Europe. Second point about whether there's a Japan study about potential U.S. withdrawal. I don't think there's a formal anything written or a formal report of that sort. But in Japan, in Tokyo, we have these study groups for various kind of research projects. And one of the groups actually talked about Plan B. Someone talked about Plan B. This is about U.S. withdrawing the commitment to defend Japan, right? But the result was there can be a Plan B for Japan. And so before reaching that conclusion, I think right now what we are doing in Tokyo is what more can we do to prevent that from happening? And I think there are many things that we can do, that the things that I mentioned earlier and all the panel Zach and Yumi talked about. I think we need to continue struggling to be able to sort of find ways to engage the United States. Japan and U.S. allies have been too sort of passive in the way we deal with the United States. I think right now we have to sort of work very hard to engage the United States. It's a new phase in a way. Japan and like-minded countries have to convince and make a compelling case to the United States that it's better for us to be cooperating and connected rather than being disengaged and divided, right? And so the debate needs to be initiated by U.S. allies. And that's the kind of dialogue I think this kind of platform, as well as other Track 2 and Track 1.5 dialogue serves. And I think this is going to be a very important contribution to that kind of discussion. So I'll stop there, yeah.
All right, we are at time. So if everyone could please join me in thanking our panelists. So let me wrap up here for all of you who have spent the day with us here. I want to start by thanking our keynote speaker, General Rupp, our panelists, our co-hosts, our audience members who attended here in person as well as online, our exceptional AV team who have been working hard the whole day, and of course, the entire support staff. If we could just please give everyone a round of applause. So as we close today's event, let me offer some final wrap-up thoughts. Despite the political changes in both of our countries over the last 6 months, the strength and friendship of the bilateral U.S.-Japan relationship represents an important continuity that often gets overlooked. The relationship in turn has an important role to play in both of our countries' efforts to shape and maintain the current rules-based international order. Now, we've heard a lot about bilateral ties today. I have a number of notes here. It's going to be hard to scribble through or to read through my scribbles here, but we heard about the challenges. We heard a lot about China, a lot about North Korea, about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, how that may affect the approach to Taiwan or thoughts about Taiwan. We also heard a lot about the U.S. approach to tariffs, as well as thinking about possibly regional prioritization. We heard the speakers talk a lot about changes, things that have gradually or maybe suddenly changed. Economic security has become more of an important topic for our countries. We heard a lot about, in the first panel, especially about the cheap yen and what effect that's having, both how the U.S. is thinking and as well as in Japan. Heard about de-risking and changes that are happening in the U.S.-Japan command relationships in the alliance. Importantly, though, we heard a lot about continuity throughout the talks today. We heard about FOIP, the importance of FOIP, the continued reliance on each other in different ways, the need for resiliency both in our economies and in security relationships. And we heard a lot about building up defense capabilities and force posture on both sides. But importantly, we heard about the strength of bilateral ties. That kept coming up throughout the talks today. And to me, that is what stands out above everything else. We heard a lot about the fact that U.S.-Japan relations remain strong, even though we are in the middle of political changes that have occurred in both our countries. And as emphasized throughout this conference, Japan and the United States look to each other in many important ways, supporting each other. Showcasing this partnership and the enduring relationship has been the central objective of this event today. We wanted to showcase the strength of U.S.-Japan alliance, even while discussing the issues and challenges facing this relationship throughout this period of political change. It's hoped that our conference here today helped shed some light on some attention on these efforts and the strength of the bilateral relationship. When looking ahead to the future, as both countries will undoubtedly undergo political change as normal reoccurring episodes in both of our countries' histories, I believe there will remain a strong foundation for our countries to continue our shared admiration of each other and our joint efforts to work together toward common goals. And so with that, let me bring the conference to a close. I want to thank you again, everyone, for attending and engaging in a thoughtful discussion. If I could go to the next slide, please. I want to remind everyone, if you haven't done so, to please visit on the second floor. Again, it is a wonderful exhibit, and it's a nice way to wrap up a full day of talking about things related to Japan. And then finally, next slide, please. Many people will be, people online will be getting a survey sent to you, but for those of you in-house here who want to do the survey right now, please use the QR code, and again, it should take you about 2 minutes total to finish this survey, and we really do appreciate it. But again, thank you, all of you, and I will bring this to a close. Thank you.